Welcome back to the IBFP. Here's your host, Foxy New.
The greatest cherry picker ever, Floyd Mayweather. Welcome to Fanboy Gods, Volume 4. Floyd Mayweather Jr., he's one of the best fighters we've ever seen. Floyd Mayweather Jr., he always says he's TBE. And the interesting thing is, there's not too many fighters that you would ever favor to be better than Floyd Mayweather. I mean, his skills inside the ring were very impressive. His defense was elite. His counterpunching was elite. His ring IQ was elite. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is seriously one of the best fighters of all time in history, and no one can ever take that from Floyd, no matter how they feel. I have to be honest about Floyd because he is truly one of the greatest fighters I've ever seen. Period. And you know what? We can never downplay his greatness as a fighter. But one thing we can do is tell the truth about Floyd Mayweather and why he was one of the greatest cherry pickers ever, if not the greatest. And half the truth is often a great lie. And what that means is, if you don't tell the whole truth, you can mislead people just as if you're telling them an outright lie. And I think the lie about this situation is that, as great as Floyd was, a lot of biased channels, biased media, and even Floyd himself will not tell you the whole truth. They'll tell you a half-truth. And that half-truth is they ignored the fact that Floyd Mayweather Jr. has cherry-picked his way into history. And we got to be honest and unbiased about it. And we break it down. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is 50-0 with 27 knockouts. His undefeated record is one of the most important things to him in his entire career. And, Floyd Mayweather did an interesting, interview where he basically picked, Emmanuel Augustus, or, at the time they called him Emmanuel Burton, basically as one of his hardest fights or his toughest fights. And this is out of all the guys that he's fought in his career, like Manny Pacquiao, Oscar De La Hoya, Cotto, Mosley, Ricky Hatton, Canelo Alvarez. He fought some top-level names, and yet you pick this guy as one of your toughest fights? Well, that's very simple and easy to explain why he picked this guy. And this guy, had 22 wins and 16 losses. No wonder he picked this guy as one of his toughest fights. You know why? Because everyone else he fought at the right time, and a lot of people ignore that. See, we got to be honest about who Floyd Mayweather is. Floyd, he fought some of the best names on his resume when they weren't at their best, and a lot of people ignore that. You even see the PBC has been modeled after Floyd Mayweather. Guys on focus only on undefeated records. They selectively matchmake their opponents and pick guys at the right time to get the biggest payday. The problem is the fighters on the PBC today are simply not as skilled as Floyd Mayweather Jr. And we got to be real about that as well. Floyd is a generational talent, no matter if he cherry picked or not. At the end of the day, when you see Floyd Mayweather and you see him face a guy like Oscar De La Hoya, he fought Oscar De La Hoya after losses to Mosley and a knockout loss to Hopkins. And this is Oscar, who was 34 years old and was on the downside of his career at that point because he had never ducked anyone. He had a lot of miles on him, yet he gave Floyd Mayweather Jr. hell. Some people even thought he beat Floyd. And this is a prime Floyd Mayweather Jr. And then, you even see a guy like Juan Manuel Marquez. He fought Marquez when he was 36 years old. 36 years old, and Marquez was moving up to weight to face Floyd Mayweather Jr. And this is a Floyd who had a height advantage, a reach advantage. And, the funny thing about this is Marquez was 36 years old, but people called Triple G and Kovalev old, but they were world champions, and fighters Canelo had to come up and weight just to fight these guys. They had those strategic advantages on Canelo. They were in a higher weight class. Both of these guys had height and reach advantages, but for Marquez, he had a height and reach disadvantage, and he was 36 and coming up in weight to face Floyd. We got to be real about it. Not only that, Marquez, he was a guy at the time who had never fought above 135 pounds. That was it. They had a catch weight contracted of 144 pounds, and Floyd Mayweather Jr. missed that weight. He came in at 146 pounds, so he had an enormous weight advantage on the guy who was obviously the smaller man. Juan Manuel Marquez was quoted as saying, "I think the weight was a big problem." And he also stated, "I think there was maybe a 20-pound difference on the night of the fight in the weight." I mean, you got to be honest. Marquez weighed in at 148 pounds on the unofficial scale right before the fight. Floyd Mayweather refused the request for a final night weigh-in. He refused it. We understand, Floyd Mayweather paid extra money because he came in overweight. And this is a guy who was moving up in weight to face Floyd. So why would you come in overweight? It just simply doesn't make sense. You got to factor all these things in, and also including the fact that Marquez was already 36 years old. We got to be honest. Then you look at a guy like Sugar Shane Mosley, a Hall of Fame caliber fighter. He even almost knocked out Floyd Mayweather Jr. in that fight. A lot of people don't know that, or a lot of people simply overlook or forget that. But not only to mention that, when Floyd, he was 33 years old, how old was Shane Mosley? Shane Mosley was 38 years old. And, Shane Mosley was older than Kovalev. He was older than Triple G. He was older than any of those guys. And, the interesting thing about this with Shane is, Floyd, he was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. He was the face of boxing. He wasn't just a regular fighter fighting Shane Mosley. No, he was the top dog. He ran boxing. And you're facing a 30-year-old Shane Mosley, and you almost got knocked out. You got to be real. If he would have fought a prime Mosley, we got to be real about it. Then you see Floyd Mayweather, when he fought Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez was 23 years old. Floyd Mayweather was a top #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Consistent #1 fighter in the world. The best boxer in the world. All the experience in the world. And yet Canelo Alvarez, he was a good fighter, but he was nowhere near where he is today. A lot of people seem to think that the Floyd Mayweather that beat Canelo back then, he beat a prime Canelo. Canelo was nowhere near his prime. Picking a guy young equates to Canelo Alvarez picking a guy like Jaime Munguia right now, washing him, and then in 7-8 years say, hey, I get credit for beating whatever Jaime Munguia turns into, if he turns into a good fighter or not. At the end of the day, you're not beating a guy that is simply at his best. A guy in his prime is at his best. He has experience. He's at his physical maturity. Those things matter. Picking a guy early is picking a guy at the right time to bolster your legacy. You even see Floyd Mayweather was not interested in a rematch with Canelo Alvarez. That would have been over $1 billion fight, according to Oscar De La Hoya. At the end of the day, we understand why. Because Floyd Mayweather would not have a strategic advantage over Canelo. We even see Floyd fought Manny Pacquiao after he was knocked out by Marquez. This was a Manny Pacquiao who was never the same. Manny Pacquiao, he's such a great fighter, yet he would go on and still be competitive and win world titles. And, that's who Manny Pacquiao was, because he's simply a great fighter overall. But he was never who he was before that knockout. He was never the same after the knockout, and Floyd fought him after the knockout. See, Floyd did not fight Manny Pacquiao when he was running through divisions, killing guys. No, that's not who Floyd fought. We got to be real. And then not to mention, Floyd moved in a certain way and picking fights in a certain way. A lot of people don't realize that Keith Thurman was Floyd Mayweather's WBA mandatory challenger back in 2015, 2016. And instead, Floyd Mayweather decided to fight Andre Berto. And Andre Berto, who had already been stopped a couple fights before. We got to be real about the situation. Floyd Mayweather was never undisputed. He never completely dominated and ruled the division by collecting all the belts. And he obviously avoided his mandatory. We got to be real. And people made excuses. I mean, this is the same Floyd Mayweather, who broke Rocky Marciano's historic record by beating a guy who had never boxed in the ring before, in Conor McGregor. But yet people complain about Canelo potentially facing a guy like Yildirim for a world title. But yet there was no world title on the line for Floyd to face Conor. The only thing that was on the line was money. That was it. And this is a guy who had never boxed. At least Yildirim is a professional boxer who's going to be a mandatory challenger for anybody who competes for that belt. See, a lot of people don't keep the same energy when you look at everybody. This is one of the greatest cherry picks of all time that's overlooked, because to beat and break a historic record, you face a guy who's never boxed. That's garbage truck juice. That fight should have been an exhibition, a sideshow, an attraction, not an actual fight. But yet it goes on your record and pads your stats. I mean, you even see Floyd avoid guys like Erislandy Lara in his prime. There's a reason why that Floyd never looked to face a guy like Lara, because he was so skilled, technical, and had strategic advantages over Floyd. But yet Floyd liked guys like, Robert Guerrero's, those type of guys, Marco Maidana, those type of guys. We got to be real about what type of guys Floyd Mayweather was looking at. Floyd even fought a guy like Marcos Maidana in a rematch because he struggled in the initial match. He fought a guy like Jose Luis Castillo in a rematch because many people viewed Floyd losing that first fight. We got to be honest about who Floyd is. Floyd is simply one of the best fighters we've ever seen in history. He's one of the most skilled, high IQ fighters. And even if he would have fought all these guys at their best, likely Floyd would have been favored to beat all these guys. But here's the interesting thing about it. Floyd probably would not be undefeated right now, because when you fight everybody when they're at their peak and they're most dangerous, you're bound to take a loss. Floyd is the TBE of cherry picking. Once again, unbiased as always, it's the IBFP.